Now, what would you say if I suggested that by the year 2050, teachers will be redundant from our schools and that future students will be learning through an online virtual classroom? Future forecaster Morris Miselowski predicts that education will be radically different to the classrooms that we know today. He joins me. Good morning again, Morris.
Good morning, Kerri.
Well, give me these predictions of the future classroom.
The future classroom is really going to be very different than the past. I mean, I have to say that I'm a futurist. But the reality is, if we think back to my schooling days, and I went through in the 60s and 70s, I had the prefix, the schools, you know, they wore their black gowns and they walked around with their strap, and yes, we still got strapped in those days. They wouldn't be allowed today. I mean, that just isn't what's going to happen. The other thing that was very different, in those days, we learnt by rote learning. You know, the teacher stood up the front and we respected them, we sat in front of them, and whatever they said, we took on board. We learnt it, we regurgitated it, and we wrote it out for our exams. So memory was really important. We studied in a very linear way. The reality is, moving forward, we're going to move into a duality, almost schizophrenic. That is, we're going to have a physical world where the students are, and they might be sitting in their classroom, but we're also going to have a virtual world, and the students are going to be studying online. They're going to be travelling inside the computer. If they're studying French, for instance, they're going to go across to France inside their computer, almost like a holodeck, and they'll be able to look at things in France and point to them and name them in French. So they're studying the culture, they're being immersed in the education, and that's the big difference. That what we'll see for the next 20 or 30 years is a continual immersion in education.
Teachers, then, where does that leave the humble teacher?
The humble teacher is always going to be necessary, but what I'm saying is by 2050 the skill set that teachers have now, the way that we're teaching, will be redundant, much the same as the teachers of old that I've spoken about. The new classrooms that are being built now, the new curriculum that's being put together now is more collaborative. The teacher is really a partner in the education. They're there to facilitate the learning, and the students are responsible for a lot of that learning themselves. As we move forward over the next 2 or 3 decades, the student's going to take on more responsibility for their learning. Nowadays we have things like Google, we can do searches. The students know where to find this information. They're really great at it. Imagine 20 or 30 years from now what they'll be able to glean for themselves.
So active learning rather than being passive and being told you must remember this, do your times table, blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely. So we're definitely going to go into that active realm.
But how do you instill that responsibility on very young kids?
The reality is that those young kids don't know any different. The kids that are being taught, if we take today's kids, those wonderful children we saw at the beginning of the show, the kids that are starting prep or grade 1 this year will be finished their education in 2020. You know, they're not going to be taught any different way. They're going to be taught that they're responsible for their education. The Australian curriculum does that for them now.
But Kevin Rudd's having a lot of trouble getting a computer in a classroom, let alone one for every child, as was promised.
Yeah, don't get me started on that. I'm not sure that the computer for every child is absolutely necessary. And I know that's a heretic for somebody who loves technology and being a futurist. But computers are a tool. It's important that we teach our children how to use that tool. Whether they have one for themselves or one between 2 or 3 isn't as important as they get the knowledge of how to use them and what they can be used for.
And you talk about the moving from the 3 R's to the 3 C's.
So the 3 R's we know are writing, arithmetic and...
reading, writing,
and arithmetic.
Yeah, reading, writing, arithmetic. Something like that, isn't it?
Absolutely. So the 3 C's are really where we're headed to. The first C is communication. But what our children really need to know is how to communicate with other people, and they need to know how to influence them. Because this world that we're moving into is all about gathering people around us.
But isn't that what teachers currently do?
They do it, but to a stilted way. So what we're doing is we teach them, but then we teach children that don't have the responsibility for doing that. So we encourage them to do it, but we stop. What the new classes are doing is they encourage children to go beyond that, to actually take the communication, to set up their small groups, to enthuse that group to work with them. Which brings me to the second one, which is collaboration. The world we're moving into is very collaborative. The children, not only within the classroom, outside the classroom, but around the world, will be meeting people either physically or virtually, and they'll have to be able to work with them on an ongoing basis. And the third and most important one that it builds towards is creative problem solving. Because the reality is, unlike the world that I grew up in, where it was fairly certain what tomorrow was going to look like, these kids really have very little idea of what they're going into. So we have to give them the fundamental skills that whatever they come up against, they'll be able to find their way through that and find a solution.
But even more recently I read there are some kids out there going into exams, year 12, who actually had to have handwriting lessons.
Incredible, isn't
Now,
it?
we all are supposed to have neat writing when we were kids, but the keyboard kids, as they talk about, and text kids, are they losing the ability, and will they lose it forever?
I think they are losing the ability. The reality is that most of them jump online somewhere around year 4, year 5, and they stay online. They type their assignments and everything they do is keyboard driven. Their handwriting is important, but it's one of those anachronistic things. It was important in my day, in our day. Is it important moving forward? And that's a debate that doesn't have an answer at the moment. But the reality is that many VCE students are having to be taught how to handwrite again. My child in year 10 is now being forced to pick up a pen to write his assignments with, so the teachers are sure when he gets to VCE that he'll be able to handwrite the answers.
Well, it will be a whole new world, and, you know, 15 years ago we didn't have the internet. 10 years ago we didn't have Google, so it's moving pretty fast. And